I'd like to invite Carrie Hagerberg from the Montana Bankers Association to lead us in this conversation. Carrie?
Hello again, everybody. I've always been told that if you want to be successful, you should emulate somebody who is successful. So I thought if I sounded like Taylor Brown, maybe I'd absorb some of that talent. It's a pretty high bar to moderate a panel after the venerable Taylor Brown, who's definitely one of my mentors. But it's an honor to be here today. One of the best times in my life was 5 months or so that I spent as the interim CEO for the Montana Chamber a few years ago, and the fact that you have me back to help moderate a panel is a real honor and a real pleasure. We all got a chance to hear from legislative leaders about their priorities and their perspectives on the upcoming session. Well, now we're going to have a chance to hear from some business leaders. And the topic is something that we talk about a lot in the lobbying world, and that is, if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. And that's how this was titled. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking back about spending time with my grandfather. My grandfather raised purebred Charolais cattle, and I followed him around like a little puppy. And I once followed him to the outhouse, literally. He turned around, he goes, "I'm just going to the outhouse, boy." But I was with him one year when we were turning the bulls out with the cows. And so we hooked the trailer up and loaded a couple bulls and pulled up to the pasture, opened the gate, and my grandfather had me open the gate, and he backed up the trailer. He turned the bulls loose, and we stood there, and I said, "Well, what do we do now, Grandpa?" And he said, "Well, we just stand back and shout out instructions." So that's my job today, is stand back and shout out some instructions. So the bios for our speakers today are in your packets. We're not going to belabor that. I will briefly introduce each panelist. David Bell, raise your hand, David. President CEO of Elps Corporation and chairs the Justice Coalition for the Montana Chamber. Brian Bird, CEO of Northwestern Energy. I get to introduce him, the very first public appearance that he's making as the official CEO of Northwestern Energy. Very cool. Bob Story, Montana Taxpayers Association. Gene Branscombe, Montana Medical Association, and David Smith, Montana Contractors Association. So let's kick this thing off. David Bell, would you lead us off, talk about some of the major themes that you see coming up in the legislative session? You have helped craft the Montana Chamber's tort reform efforts. We've heard a lot about that over the last 2 days. And maybe talk about how that came about and how you see the session unfolding.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and just want to appreciate everybody as we ring in the new year and begin an exciting 2023 ahead of us. So I have the privilege of chairing the Justice Coalition, and that is a combination of businesses that are members of the state chamber. And in a nutshell, we really look for ways to effectuate common sense judicial reform through the legislative process. And it's a very broad, encompassing exercise that involves pretty much any member of the state chamber who is interested and wants to engage. And I don't know exactly how many, quote, members we have, but I'm going to guess around 50. So this is not some smoky dark room where a few people make important decisions about the direction that the chamber should take. This is a very open democratic process. And from an Alps perspective, which is my day job, we are the largest insurer of lawyers' malpractice in the country. And we have the privilege of being based in Missoula. And at the manufacturers panel yesterday, something was said that I hadn't really thought about from the Alps context, that these folks were making items and shipping them inside and outside the country, and dollars are coming back into our state. And that's a really cool concept. And And it gave me an opportunity to think about that from the ALPS perspective, because every month millions of dollars flows from 47 other states into our states that employ a lot of people in Missoula to help make that ecosystem go around. But the catbird seat is one that we have from a legal malpractice insurance company perspective, because when lawyers make mistakes or are alleged to have made mistakes, they do so around a myriad of the aspects of the judicial process, right? They make mistakes related to personal injury and accident and health and work comp and all sorts of things. So it does give us a rather unusual high perch of perspective of where there are issues in the judiciary that could be addressed from a legislative perspective. And I think the state chamber has really leaned forward into that. And so let me just set kind of the baseline, which is first something that I think no matter where we live in this state, no matter what party we affiliate with, we can probably all agree that Montana is the greatest state in the country. It is and remains that so. Yes, absolutely. And we strive to be better in all sorts of categories. There's a slide on the screen. I think there might be some printouts, and there are a couple areas that we clearly have quantitative, objective data evidencing opportunities for us to get better. This particular slide is a relatively recent study that came out from the U.S. Chamber Institute of Legal Reform that ranks the tort cost as a percentage of state GDP, the tort cost per Montanan, per household as a percentage of state GDP. And we have the very inauspicious ranking out of 50 states of number 6, right? So that's the first point. Whether or not tort reform is important, I think is answered on this slide. Tort reform is important, and it's important for us because it places a significant burden on the men and women all around our state. And there are common sense ways to address it. And let me just go to another visual to give you another example. If you could just visualize a race. There's a race, like a track and field race. There are 5 runners. And in that race, the stakes are high. And you and I and everyone in here, and everyone down the street in particular, as the legislature convenes, are empowered with giving resources to one of those runners. That runner is Montana, and in this example, we're comparing Montana to our neighbors, right? We have 4 neighboring states, and there was a comment made in the panel just before that. There were several comments made that I thought were really important and that we should reflect on over this panel about insurance premiums. And the cost of insurance for homeowners and auto is one of the more ubiquitous insurance realities for Montana citizens. Healthcare is healthcare insurance is a dynamic in and of itself. There are so many cost drivers and ingredients in the healthcare formula that are unique to healthcare that I'm going to separate property and casualty from healthcare. But we can simply look, and when we ask ourselves, is tort reform a problem? Because does tort reform play a role in the insurance premiums that you pay and I pay, because I assume we both drove here today? And the answer is we stack up in last place right now. In that race of 5 that you and I are responsible for nourishing the Montana runner, we have an opportunity that we must seize to not be in last place. Maybe we won't get in first, at least not initially, but we should strive together. You and I and the 4 members of the panel that preceded this one should strive together to not be number 5 out of 5 for these 5 states. And I would suggest to you, if you go to the third and final slide, please, if you kind of look at how we stack up better in homeowners than in auto, but in general, there's demonstrable opportunity for us to climb. If you look at Idaho, I might argue that Idaho's economy might be a little bit more reflective of Montana's economy than some of the other bordering states, but there's some pretty significant differences in what the citizens of those states are paying. And somebody said at the last panel, well, I got to be convinced that tort reform is contributing to the insurance rates that we pay. And let me tell you, without a shadow of a doubt, tort reform is a contributor. It is not the only reason why we pay more than our neighboring states, but it is a meaningful reason. Regulation is a reason. The judiciary is a reason. right? Let me just kind of call the elephant in the room, the uncertainty with which you approach the Supreme Court. For insurance companies nationally, I'm on a board with the CEOs of all of the major insurance companies in the country. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that the uncertainty facing an experience at the Supreme Court is a factor. And of course, our statutory framework is a factor. So I'll just wrap up by saying, as I reflect on another observation that was made, where I thought it was curious that multiple panelists anticipated tort reform being among the more controversial of the different legislative initiatives. I actually don't think that it will be, because the tort reform bills that we have prepared thoughtfully in a balanced way with a lot of contributors from different perspectives, they take a very surgical approach to strike at some of the more egregious elements of how our existing statutory framework is exploited and how Montana citizens pay for that exploitation. It does not, in any way, shape, or form, frustrate the redress of Montana citizens to have their day in courts, as was suggested, and as was suggested appropriately. If it did, and if that concern from one of the members who clearly hasn't seen the text of the bills that we've got, I think we would all probably have grave concerns about that. These bills don't do that. They're very thoughtful, they're very surgical in their intent, and maybe as we circle around, I'd be happy to talk about any number of the tort reform priorities that the Chamber has. Thank you.
Great, thanks, David. The Montana Bankers Association has one of our top priorities to support the Chamber in the tort reform efforts in the upcoming legislature. So we really appreciate your efforts, David, and the Chamber's leadership on that issue. Last I looked, there's well over 4,000 bill draft requests in the hopper. They're adding by the minute. I think about 1,000 or more say something like generally revised taxes. So Bob, you're up. What are you going to do about it? How do you view the 1,000 or so bill draft requests that are going to be dealing with taxes in some way, shape, or form?
Well, hopefully we don't have to deal with all of them.
You're on.
We're going to get some sound here.
Is your mic on?
I was told it was on. Put me on the previous one. All right. So of the 1,000 or so that have been requested, there's been about 400 of them actually in the process of being drafted and introduced, and 28 bills introduced and 325 unintroduced that have titles on them, and then the other ones are just sitting there as placeholders. I'm going to just run briefly through, the previous panel talked a lot about the governor's bills. I'm just going to run through and remind you what they all are. The governor has about 7 priorities and bills that he wants. One is to lower the individual income tax rate, and I can talk about that in a bit. Increase the exemption of business equipment up to $1 million. Again, that was discussed this morning. Refunds on property tax. That's the president has that bill in, and it's been drafted. There's a capital gains treatment bill that's out there. That's part of the governor's plan, I understand. Then a couple of tax credits, one for young children, families to help. It's my understanding, so one of the parents of a young children can stay home and take care of them as opposed to go to work and pay to put them in child care like that. And then also an adoption credit bill that's out there to encourage folks to adopt. There's a few other legislative proposals that probably are worth noting. Senator Hertz, chairman of the Senate Tax, has bringing back the single sales factor corporate tax apportionment bill that came last year and got a little bogged down in the process. It turned into still a 3-part apportionment with a double weighted sales factor, but they're coming back now with a single sales factor. They think they've solved most of the problems with that. I don't know if that's the case yet or not. We're supporting a bill for over 20 years, Montana's been the only state in the nation that has a tax haven list. So if you're a multinational corporation and do business in certain countries that are listed in the Montana statute, you have to bring those into your total income when you do water's edge treatment. For those of you that understand corporate tax, we're going to try to get rid of that this year. We've not been able to do that in the past, and we've also opposed updating the list so it's a little more modern. So we've kind of got a bad situation there that needs to be dealt with. The forest land people have worked with the Department of Revenue over the interim and come up with some changes in how forest land is valued and how their appraisal cycle is going to work. I think they want to move back to a 2-year cycle like all the other cyclical property and get off the 6-year one. There's going to be a bill to increase we have a tax credit for film companies that come to Montana and film. It has a fairly limited cap on it. They're going to propose increasing that cap to $30 million and spreading out how long a company can access that money, largely driven by the Yellowstone experience and other bringing other film companies to Montana to expand that industry. The Department of Revenue wants to look at breaking the centrally assessed property into a couple groups and doing a valuation of them every other year instead of every year, just in part because of staffing issues and in part because the time frame crunch doesn't allow those businesses to participate fully in the process of negotiating their values and dealing with that. They end up with a lot of potential protested taxes and litigation there. One of the things that the department has trouble with in valuing commercial properties like you folks have is using an income-based valuation method, because a lot of companies don't want to give that income tax data or that income data to the department in the property tax system, because property taxes in Montana are all public knowledge. All that information is public information, and so they're going to bring a bill that allows them to keep income data confidential if it's used in valuing commercial property under the income method. Hopefully we can get that one passed. And then you heard discussion this morning about property tax relief for homeowners, and I think that's going to be probably one of the big issues of the session. As Speaker Regier mentioned this morning, income taxes is almost 60% of the state general fund collections, but no one's complaining about their income taxes. Property taxes are the issue people are concerned about right now, and they're going to be even more concerned about them as they understand that the next cycle of reappraisal, which they'll start paying taxes on next November, residential property on the averages could increase at 43% over the last 2 years. So people are going to be awfully concerned about that. And so the legislature is going to have a lot of bills to deal with. What do we do about property taxes, especially residential property taxes? Commercial is in that same mix, though, because they're both in the same class, and commercial property on the statewide average is going to increase probably 15 to 20% in value also. So the legislature is going to spend a lot of time dealing with that, and that's the most complex tax issue that they can deal with. Dropping the income tax rate from 6.5 to 5.9 is pretty simple. I mean, everybody understands that, how that's going to work, what the effects might be, and so that's pretty much a black and white issue. Property taxes, especially when you look at one class of property, residential, is a lot more complex, because what they don't pay, everybody else pays. And so if you decrease that value, so historically what's happened when you had those, back when we had the 6-year reappraisal cycle, was you just said statewide residential property is not going to pay any more taxes than they did the previous cycle, so you just reduce the tax rate. Well, that works fine on a statewide average, but it doesn't work at all at the local level, because some places you take too much value out, some you don't take enough out. The mills move around, you shift taxes, and it just, nobody really understands the final result of their solution. It's just, this is what we've always done, so we need to do it again. That hasn't been done for 6 years since they went to the 2-year reappraisal cycle, because the increases haven't been so much that people were upset about it. But we'll see this time. I think that's where we're going to spend a lot of time dealing with the property tax system. And why is that a big problem? You heard the panel up here talk about, well, that's a local issue. You know, we at the state level really don't need to deal with that. Well, that's not true. The state does collect 95 mills. They do put it in the general fund. It does eventually flow back to schools. But because of the reappraisal and the 43% increase in residential and the 15% increase in commercial, the state of Montana on the 95 mills is going to collect almost $90 million new dollars next year that they haven't collected in the past. And that's ongoing permanent revenue to the state. And so, you know, they talk about giving $1,000 back to each homeowner, Montana resident homeowner. That fiscal bill's not going to be anywhere near $90 million. So then what do you do with the rest of it? And how do you convert that into tax reductions at the local level? And there's plans to do that, but only a few people are working on them, and very few people understand all that. So that's where we're going to spend quite a bit of time. I just want to say on the income tax system, you heard, I think, the president say that we need to give the money back to those people who paid it. That's not going to happen politically. In the Montana income tax system, the top 10% of the filers pay 54% of the income tax. So you're not going to give the top 10% of the filers back all that money. You're going to redistribute it through the system. The bottom 60% of the filers pay 10% of the income tax. So, you know, you're going to have a wealth redistribution system going on there somehow when they do that. So those are kind of some of the things that we see coming down and that we're going to have to work on. I think the most important takeaway from the morning panel was it doesn't look like the governor's plan has a whole lot of support. We'll see how that comes as the process moves along, but I think there's going to be a whole lot of competing ideas out there that have to work their way through the system.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for keeping them honest. For those of you that represent businesses in the room that are not members of the Montana Taxpayers Association, I encourage you to consider joining. They do yeoman's work for all of us. When we have tax questions as association lobbyists, we go right to Bob. So I'll put in a little plug for the Taxpayers Association. Next, we're going to hear from the largest taxpayer in the state of Montana. And first, congratulations, Brian, on becoming the new CEO of the company, Montana's largest taxpayer. What do you see coming up in the Montana legislative session? And you've got a whole fleet of really talented lobbyists, and what are you going to have them working on?
Yesterday, I think the thing I would want to talk about before I get to the legislative aspect is last week on Megan's slide, she showed later in the week we had a lot of wind resources that helped us meet our load. But earlier in the week, we didn't, and we had to call upon our fossil fuel resources to help meet our loads. And matter of fact, what we didn't have sufficient capacity being those plants that you can turn on and operate on and off 24/7. We don't have sufficient capacity in our fleet today, so almost 50% of our power had to be imported into the state. And I think all of us would agree that's not very good energy independence. And so we're trying to solve that from our aspect. Building the Yellowstone County plant in Billings, it's a gas-fired plant, 18 units that you can turn on and off, and they can offset the variability of our renewable resources, our wind and soon-to-be solar resources that are coming on our system. So it's helpful with that. But equally important, on the coldest days, you can turn on all 18 units and run them full out for days, 24/7. And so that plant is being built near Laurel, and we need that plant to come online in 24 to help serve our customers, so we're not paying for power from others and relying on others to provide that capacity. We spent $20 million, and when I say that, our customers ultimately are going to spend $20 million to cover those costs during that week. We had our highest electric peak last week and our highest gas peak. We're in a bit of a crisis mode here, and so switching back to thinking about our resources, and by the way, as a company, we have more renewables than the average of utilities in the United States. In Montana, we're close to 60% of renewables. Think hydro, which I believe is the best renewable resource. You get high capacity from those resources. Wind, and wind is a fantastic resource when the wind is blowing. And then our fossil fleet. And so we're about a third hydro, a third wind, and a third fossil fleet. And in our fossil fleet is also Colstrip. I see the Talon folks here. Last week, when we had our coldest days here, Colstrip was running like crazy. And we appreciate our operator making sure that plant was available to serve our customers. And so it's important to have, and I heard the governor say this on Fox, it's important to have an all of the above resource profile. And we're lucky to have that here in Montana. Unfortunately, you may remember back in 2008 is when we were first allowed to even own generation resources. And we've tried to build that portfolio over the years, but it's taken a lot of time, and most utilities have owned their generation resources for 100 years. We're working on getting there to 20 years. And so we have Colstrip. We're trying to build Yellowstone County. We have contracted wind with quite a few folks, and that's very, very helpful to us, obviously, when the wind's blowing. And so we continue to add resources, but we still are short capacity versus our neighbors. But our reliance on those neighbors is too much today, and we need to do something about that. So how does that all relate back to what the legislative session is going to do? And we have a relatively short agenda, but one thing I do want to talk about is something called pre-approval. It's a statute that allows us to, go in front of the commission, ask to get recovery, if you will, or ask to get approval of a plant before we actually put it in service. And what happened was that statute, when it was approved, it really indicated one utility in it, and that was us. And the reason we wanted that statute way back in 2008 is we were emerging from bankruptcy, and we persuaded folks that our investors weren't going to give us the money to go build any plants unless we had assurance from our regulators we could get recovery. Well, here recently, the courts decided since only one party received that benefit, it was deemed unconstitutional. One thing we want to do in this legislative session is change that. There's not a lot of regulated utilities in Montana, but if we can have more than one, it would no longer be deemed unconstitutional. So we need to deal with that issue. The word pre-approval has a negative connotation, and I will tell you, how did it even get the word pre-approval? We used to get approval, after you build something, and most of the things that we do, put poles in the ground, put gas pipe in the ground, you get approval of that after it's put in service. But I think everyone knows electric generation resources are very controversial, and so getting assurance that you're going to get those costs up front, and they're also very expensive. This plant we're building at Yellowstone County plant is almost a $300 million plant. That's 1/10 of our market capitalization. And if we don't get recovery of those costs, somebody else might be dealing with the next bankruptcy. We're a bit in a crisis mode. And so it's important for us to have had that decision to go ahead with that plant, get that approval in advance. And what does that do for us? What it does is it gives certainty. It's not like you're going to pay for that plant before it goes into service. It's the same thing. You're going to pay for it the day it goes in service. You're not going to prepay. You're not going to pay an estimated amount. You're going to pay what actually is due on that plant. All we're asking for is to get the approval today versus after it's already built and ultimately put in rates in years to come. And so the pre part, I think, became because it was previous to ultimately getting approval at the end. We're going to call it really an application for consideration, which is the language that's in the statute already. And that's the primary thing we're going to be working on. I just want to remind folks, when I think about the peaks of last week, and by the way, the electric peak, we're both a winter and summer peaking. Our peak before last pre-Christmas was in the summer of 22. And so as I'm going to just put it in the context for you this way, as electrification continues to go up, as Montana continues to grow, the demands in our system continue to increase. As the capacity continues to go down, think closing coal-fired plants, the criticality of resources like the Yellowstone County plant and these other resources that you can turn on 24/7, things like Colstrip, are crucial. And we need to have an all-of-the-above portfolio of resources to serve our customers. And so primarily, and forget about the pre-approval aspect of it, think about this application for consideration. That's what we're going to be working on this legislative session.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Good insights. We're going to hear from the medical community, Gene Branscombe. What do you see coming up in the legislature? I didn't hear Medicaid expansion come up as the most controversial issue facing the business community and the legislature, so that's got to be something of a relief that that's behind us. What's coming up?
Well, there's many issues coming up with healthcare, and I thank everyone for attending today, and I really appreciate having healthcare on the panel today because that is an important component of the cost that you're paying as businessmen, but it also dives into your productivity of your workforce along with your bottom line. So thank you for having us on the panel. I also had talked to Todd O'Hara before this, and I have a couple of announcements that aren't such great news for you. One of the things is we're going to have to do some screening after this just to make sure you understood what Bob's story said about the tax stuff coming up. And so you have multiple entry and exit points, but everyone's going to have to go out that door over there. And we're going to do a bit of screening because they feel that that's really important policy, and all of you should have a basic understanding of that. And if you have to use the toilet, got another bad news piece for you. We've also decided, because there's been a huge increase of STDs in the state, we're doing additional screening but in the toilet area. So I think we're going to have to pick a table, maybe John Binion. If your table could be a screener, you could pick the toilet or the door there. We're going to do a little bit of training. We don't have much workforce. We have workforce issues out there in healthcare, so we're going to have to get someone kind of really quick. We'll do a little bit 5-minute training. You guys will all be real comfortable here while we do that. So thanks for that appreciation for the chamber doing that. And that pretty much sums up what healthcare policy is. Somebody else is practicing medicine. Somebody else decides how to run the industry. And the rest of us have to kind of figure it out. And that's what's happening this session. I'm going to kind of go back to my book here. I have a book here. It's called It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year. That's where my notes are. I get to start with that chapter. My next book, when I fill this one up, is Get Her Done. And then the third book I pick up is Are They Gone Yet? And so with the medicals, we got lots of things going on. I'm going to burn through a lot of topics here, so hang on tight. But again, this is important to you because we've got your workers, and they need health care where they're at. They don't want to travel 2 to 3 hours, and they have families, and they want to travel and see their families close by in nursing homes, and they also have kids, and they want to be able to pick those kids up at school when they're ill and get them to a place where they can get care pretty quickly. If that all doesn't happen, that means you don't have workers, and they're worried about what's happening in family. And I think we all know that workers are also trying to find that family-work balance, and we're seeing a lot of anxiety in our state as well. And so mental health issues are kind of peaking up, as well as addiction issues in our state. And those are things that are going to be themes that you're going to see this coming session. Cost to you, I thought one thing that we didn't hear was Medicaid expansion, but we didn't hear any ideas on how to drive down healthcare costs on our panel here too. So I think that's the other thing to keep aware of is as we talk about things that are concerning to us and why you should be concerned, your bottom line is affected by healthcare costs. It ends up in those insurance premiums. And I would say one of the drivers of healthcare costs is your legislative body and the regulations they pass that cost money for healthcare institutions and providers to do and to staff up. We are businesses, and those businesses have the same issue that all of you have, and I'll touch upon that because workforce is definitely one of the top. When I came up to this and we talked about are you on the menu or on the table, I would say the menu for healthcare is you need about 1 gallon of effective patient care, 2 cups of infrastructure stability, 2 cups of a competent workforce and available workforce. You need 3 teaspoons of public health and prevention, a spoon of transparency and social determinant care, and just a whole dash of hope, whipped together with just support of your healthcare folks. I can tell you that when you talk about anxiety, your healthcare professionals are experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it's no different than what people have experienced if they come back after the pandemic war. They're not feeling real good out there, and they're feeling that they could use some support. And so that's part of the issues that are coming forward when we take a look at legislation is, I asked what legislators could do. I think the top thing was, could they just leave us alone? We got a lot to deal with now. But what we got going on is we've got controversial topics. I bet you can think of what those might be. But on top of the page is going to be reproductive health. So abortion, I think we have over 800 bills that I'm tracking, and abortion has many bill request topics in there. Transgender care, physician-assisted suicide, and vaccines. And so those are all extraordinarily emotionally driven, and those are going to be top on the agenda. And we're going to have to get through those and work through the legislative branch to make sure that we have good policies in regards to those areas so that we can get on to other business-oriented legislation, talk about tax relief, and talk about other healthcare pieces. Other things in terms of patient-centered care and access, we have a bulk of legislation related to mental health. And we do have a bit of Medicaid expansion coming up, which is good news. In part of the governor's budget, there is a piece of that expansion which has to do with postpartum maternal care. Right now, after a mom has a baby, we cover that person for 60 days. This will give that coverage up to 12 months. So that means that an individual, after having a baby, they can continue to get health care. And if they have mental health issues, addiction issues, or just need other kind of care, it can happen there. U.S. is like one of the worst nations when it comes to maternal care and the death rate surrounding that maternal moms after that first year of birth. You heard today about continuous eligibility. The other piece that we anticipate seeing is, again, the criminalization of medicine. And so we have a lot of those different kind of social issues that go out there, and there's usually a tough penalty. So you get to go to jail, you get to pay a fine, you have the ability to lose your license so you can never work again as a physician or a nurse. And all of those things are highly impactful to another top issue for healthcare, and that's going to be our workforce issues. So just like all of you, healthcare has top issues in regards to the workforce or lack thereof workforce that's going to be dealt with in several different pieces of legislation. Certainly housing, childcare are important to that, but also provider rates. There's been a provider rate study over the interim, and there's a provider rates increases as part of the governor's budget, which is going to help in regards to providing those needed individuals the money they need to take care of individuals that are in government-paid programs. We also will see a supporting of pipelines. So WAMI, that's a Medical School of Montana. They celebrated their 50th year this year, continuing support of that, continuing to support of residency programs. We're actually getting 2 new medical schools in the state of Montana. WAMI has 30 students per class. Each of these medical schools have 100 per class, so we're going to balloon from 30 students a year to, 230? And so you'll see a bill come forward on a tax credit to encourage physicians and other providers to teach Montana students going to a Montana school to become a physician, nurse, pharmacist, etc. So helping bolster up the teaching faculty that we know we need. Another big piece that's coming through is licensure and reciprocity. If you haven't taken a look at Title 37, there's been a major effort on the reform of occupational licensure. It's moving us to you're all widgets, and the licensure is a widget, and definitely need to take a look at the impact of that in terms of the healthcare side of licensing when we want to make sure that we have competent, well-trained individuals taking care of all of us and all of our families, that maybe we want a little bit more than just handing out a widget. we want to make sure that those individuals are going to be the right folks to take care of those that we really love and care about. There's also bills that'll be a change of scope. So with workforce issues, a lot of times other pieces of the solution is who else could we look around the room and get to provide care, because we have a shortage. So we'll see some of those individuals coming forward too. The other things that we'll see is how we can address costs and how we can also deal with workforce by reducing paperwork. So you're going to see legislation on prior authorizations. I think all of us have seen a prior authorization or have been impacted, probably had delayed care because we can't get the care needed because we're waiting for approval for that to happen. There'll be prior authorization legislation to get rid of it completely, or at least put sideboards on it so that care can be provided generally in a good way. The other pieces are infrastructure. I just want to mention that we're going to see some bills this time in regards to community benefits and charity care for our hospitals. So a little bit more transparency is going to be sought in that world. I think it's important for all of us to pay attention to that. Again, they're businesses. It's one thing to have the transparency. It's another thing if they have lined out regulations of what has to be done. You got to have the flexibility in that particular area. Other big changes is in regards to infrastructure is we have a $500 million budget infusion or investment into our state hospital and corrections. So that's where we do most of our mental health treatment, I think, in the state of Montana. So they're going to invest some money in that. We might see some regionalization in regards to that mental health treatment. They're also put forward as a committee a new certified behavioral health clinic model that also will help with improvements in the mental health arena. So those are a whole bunch of things that are headed all our direction. I hope you pay attention to them. Again, as a business sector, I think it would be great to see some folks pop into the health committee and talk about how important it is to have affordable health care, quality health care in Montana, and that we should let the folks that practice medicine and practice a profession do the practicing and not have individuals that don't practice that field, haven't gone through the training, select and pick what's good and what's bad. So who's on the table? I think who's on the table is businesses and patients. So come out and help us.
Thank you, Jean, and thanks for injecting a little bit of humor and levity into a very serious discussion. We appreciate that. You know, I've always thought if I had to be on the menu, I want to be the liver and onions. So go over there. The filet mignon's over there. We saved David for last, in part because I spent 8 legislative sessions in his shoes. The last 3 or 4 of those legislative sessions, I felt like Oliver Twist. Please, sir, may I have some more gruel? Trying to get bonding bills passed and infrastructure bills. And David, now the money is just falling out of the sky.
Well,
Hundreds of millions of dollars. What are you going to do with it?
Thanks, Carrie. Are we on the menu or at the table? I'll tell you that the construction industry right now is at the table. And there's a huge pile of bacon and some pork chops and some ham there for us, so that courtesy of the federal government. CARES 2 brought in $102 million to MDT for maintenance and construction. ARPA brought in $463 million for water and sewer projects, $275 million for broadband. The Infrastructure Act, $225 million for bridge replacement and repairs over 5 years, $144 million for Montana airports, mostly rural ones, $100 million for the Milk River project. So you start throwing $100 million here and $100 million there, and pretty soon you got some real money that's coming into the state. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. A lot of that is going to be divided amongst the engineering companies to design all of this work. So it doesn't just go to all of my larger members, but it certainly ends up there at the end. Construction, just as a part of the Montana economy, in February of 2020, there were 30,900 people employed in the construction trades in Montana. And November, last month, there were 34,200. So that's a gain of 3,300 people. in a time where we're seeing rising interest rates and scarce supplies. So kind of a little bit of a dichotomy, and even in November we had an additional 500 people added to the construction roles, which usually November, December, we're taking long vacations for the construction trades. And I don't think it's just in the housing, because we've seen a little bit of slowdown in the housing side. My membership consists of the heavy highway, the civil, and the large commercial construction projects. So nice to see some good, strong employment growth there. But nationally, there's 412,000 jobs open in construction right now. And that number continues to keep going up, and now with the billions of dollars that are coming through the pipeline, there's just going to be more and more that's out there. So a lot of that is good news. So the bad news, like everybody else, is workforce and supplies. So as far as workforce goes, the number of people that we need for jobs, most every contractor would say, well, I'd hire a full other crew if I could, but I can't. And so what that causes is a backlog of projects. So the project that you think you're going to build a hotel for $40 million ends up being a $60 million project 2 years later. So a lot of ripple effects that happen there. There's a Dodge Momentum Index is what it's called, that tracks the number of projects that are starting in the pipeline. And this is not a Montana figure, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's way off. So nationally, that Dodge Momentum Index is up 3.8% right now. That's saying that there's a lot of projects that are entering the planning, the design, the approval stage, the funding stage, that'll be coming online for construction in 12 to 24 months. Montana, we're going to certainly have some big ones, a couple of hospitals being built, universities, and power plants. We like those. Those are good. A lot of concrete in those things. We like that. So there's still a significant backlog of projects out there that most contractors have. So let's talk about materials and what we call input. So over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot, and especially recently, about inflation and the cost of goods and services that come in. So here's some of the products that are used in construction, and here's their year-over-year price change. So first of all, I'll start off with lumber. Y'all remember lumber? Everybody was on the front page. Lumber was skyrocketing. It was out of control. In the last year, lumber has actually come down 27%. Of course, it went up 2,000%, before that. So 27% down, we'll take that. Let's see, flat glass, 8.2% increase. Aluminum mill shapes, 20% increase. Insulation, 16% increase. Plastic construction products, 27%. Steel mill products, 22%. Concrete products, 13.5%. 43 states are actually on ration for construction concrete materials. Gypsum products up 18.9%. Copper and brass, actually this is kind of good news because that one spiked a while ago too, but right now that's pretty flat. Number 2, diesel fuel over a year ago is up 111%. So as these owners are getting increased prices by the month or by the day, that's what's going on. That's what's in behind this. There was a steel company out of Utah that announced on October 27th that on November 1st they were going to increase the price of all their rebar by 11%. So what do you do when you've already bid a project and you are faced with that kind of a price increase? So legislatively, overall, we were sure pleased with the change to the apprenticeship ratios, allowing more young people, people who are starting off in any kind of a trade, to enter with fewer journeymen supervising them. We started a program 2 years ago called Build Montana that is a pretty good example of the industry pulling itself up. And we've got equipment dealers, contractors working together to get young people out of the schools and onto job sites, learning about how we make little rocks out of big rocks. And that's what we're trying to do with more of these. Electric vehicles, going to be on our radar. In fact, it comes up Friday afternoon. Hopefully we'll get that passed this time. Got it passed last time and the time before, but hopefully this time the governor will sign it. We are always in a gravel fight of some sort. Nobody likes a gravel pit next to their house. But you know what? I mean, this building is built with gravel. You know, that it's wherever we are, we need gravel as it's a huge resource. Workforce issues, we'll be following a lot of those and trying to influence that and improve that as we can too. Glad to hear some discussion about mental health here today. I think this is something we've all ignored for long enough, and nobody more probably than the construction industry. So you probably know Montana, depending on which study or which year you're looking at, we're about number 3 in the nation in suicide. Construction is the number 1 occupation for suicide. So we got a real big issue that I've got to deal with my members, and that's their mental wellness and helping them through the dark days where they've been laid off for 3 months and they can't work, or being away from home for 6 months during the summertime when you're on the road and you're living in a trailer, and what else are you going to do? Well, there's beer, there's whiskey, there's opioids. None of those things are really positive things. So in the end, I think those are all issues that we've got to tackle. You know, as has been said, as collectively we've got to tackle a lot of those issues. And so those are kind of some of the things we're looking at, and that's what's going on in the construction world. So
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Appreciate those insights. We're going to circle back now, kind of to where we started with a few questions. Be thinking about some questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. First, David, assume that these tort reform bills pass and the governor signs them. They end up litigated and going to our court system. What would you anticipate the courts in Montana doing with some of these initiatives the chamber and you are working on?
That's a good question, and it's a challenge that lots of bills that have had a lot of thought and planning invested into them have ultimately been turned back. So because of that, we put a great deal of preemptive resources into a constitutional assessment, and we have what I would argue are some of the brightest constitutional minds in our state look at the language that's being drafted from a constitutional perspective to ensure that there's proper insulation from the inevitable challenge that finds its way into the Supreme Court. So we go into this feeling informed and comfortable that these bills will stand the test of a constitutional challenge.
Awesome. Brian, I visited with Brian a little bit last night, and I'll just share, an observation story. 2 weeks ago, I guess, it was 30 below zero. I walked outside. It had snowed. So solar panels were covered in snow. It had been dark all night. There was not a wisp of wind blowing, so the wind turbines weren't turning. Everybody in the state was trying to heat their homes and get their cars started. And by the way, we're supposed to be driving electric vehicles, all of us, within the next several years. General Motors isn't even going to make internal combustion engines in a few years. So how in the world are we going to supply electricity for our consumers and businesses, not only in Montana, but throughout the country?
Well, one thing I would talk about on this regard is, I used the word crisis before, and I apologize if that sounds a little too shocking, but the planning it takes to actually design, engineer, permit, and ultimately build, let alone, before all that, even get approval to move forward with projects, takes a lot of time. And that's a generation project. And a lot of renewable resources, by the way, they need transmission to move those resources to the grid. That takes a tremendous amount of permitting. And so my real concern here is we're seeing peaks back-to-back summer. Now, it used to be just a winter peaking utility. Now it's a summer and winter peaking utility. And we're going to see that every year. I'm very nervous about the amount of generation we're going to be able to get online and the transmission we're going to be able to design and build to help move these resources around. We do have a lot of wind in the north. We need to get that down to the south. The Billings area where we're building this Laurel plant, the Yellowstone County plant, Billings just takes about a third of the power of the state. And with the closure of the Corette plant there and closure of units 1 and 2 at Colstrip, that power isn't in the Billings area at this point in time. So it's real crucial for us to build that plant. But we're also going to have to build transmission to move power around and where the resources are to move it. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think we spend a lot of time on process and not a lot of time on making things happen to deal with these infrastructure issues. And so I will just say this, I don't want to come across as negative on renewables, back to a third. I think we're in a really good spot. And wind, when the wind's blowing, is obviously a very economical resource, and we love it. And we're going to be adding solar. It's going to be great too. But we just need to understand that every day there's going to be probably different resources you need or you're going to see in our profile. I appreciate Megan showing that slide yesterday. You can go to our webpage and see what the resources are to meet our load each day. Back to Carrie's question about, snow on the panels, we also have people who are kind of predicting what that load's going to be. We're looking at a day ahead, weeks ahead, months ahead in terms of what our load expectations are. So there's a tremendous amount of planning that goes on just on a week-by-week, day-by-day basis in order to serve our customers. And I think sometimes people don't realize we have to balance the system on a real-time basis every minute. So when wind's going up, like you saw on that slide the other day, that can happen on an inter-day basis. We have to have a resource to offset that, and to plan for that's really difficult to do. So that's just on a day-to-day basis. But the thing I'm more worried about is with EVs, with electrification, we're going to continue to see increased demand, and I'm nervous we're not going to move quick enough to build the generation we need, to build the transmission we need. And that's on the electric side of our business. Another thing that's going to come up here is that a lot of people don't like natural gas. Those of you who have natural gas fired heaters at home, you really loved them last week, I'll tell you that. And by the way, the demand for natural gas continues to go up each and every year. We have constraints on our transmission system on the gas side as well, based upon that increased demand. So the other thing to keep in mind from an infrastructure standpoint, and I appreciate the comments about construction, business development, economic development starts with energy. And if we don't have the infrastructure here, we're not, Montana's growing, that's primarily been a good thing. But without that infrastructure, it's going to be really hard for us to continue to attract businesses because we just aren't going to have the capacity to provide that. And so, long way to answer your question. It's just a lot of planning is going to need to take place, and we're going to have to do a better job collectively through the legislative process, the regulatory process, and we as the utilities and others, the co-ops and others, of planning the resources we need. It's really scary to me to see rolling blackouts in the United States. We're a first world country. That I just never expected we'd see that. And the Texas crisis is my first day of the job as a chief operating officer 2 years ago in February, right after Valentine's Day. South Dakota had its first rolling blackouts in its history of Northwestern Energy. And that kind of blows your mind a bit. I've been in business for 100 years. It's the first time in 100 years to have rolling blackouts. And Montana, we've come close. We have come really close to having that happen here. Because what happens in California, these markets are all interconnected, and there's a heavy reliance on our neighbors to provide capacity. And our transmission group and our energy supply group, headed here by John Hines, they do a great job working together to make sure we have what we need to serve our customers. And I guess what we'd like at the end of the day, a little bit, much like on the healthcare side, the people who understand how to run these utilities will let us do what we need to do to actually do it.
Great. Thanks for that candid answer, Brian. We really appreciate it. I caught Nancy Schlepp's eye a minute ago, and it just, editorial comment on my part strikes me as so ironic that the same interest groups that are pushing renewable energy and electric vehicles are fighting the copper mines to supply the materials for those wind farms. And I don't know where we go, as a society and as a state when we have that kind of push-pull going on. But that's the kind of things that we'll deal with in the legislative arenas, the permitting. So, Bob Story, wave the magic wand of the Montana Taxpayers Association and very briefly describe in your mind what the ideal tax structure would look like. And,
Well, I'm a little reluctant now after apparently nobody understood what I said the last time. Well, any tax structure, the more balance you have in your tax structure, the better it is. And Montana doesn't have a balanced tax structure, and we may never have one, but it's getting more unbalanced all the time. And that is, our property tax. When I first started in this in 1995, the total property tax collections in the state were maybe $800 million. Right now, they're $2 billion. The income tax collections were $450 million. Now they're pushing $2 billion. And those are our two main sources of taxes, and what most people, even in the legislature, don't understand, although they're at least the leadership kind of sees it. Property taxes are all a local function, pretty much. They fund cities, counties, schools, miscellaneous districts. Income tax funds state operations, and so the state it's over 60% of the state revenue is coming from individual income taxes right now. That makes bond raters nervous. That should make legislators nervous. That should make policymakers nervous, budgeters nervous, because anytime you have so dependent on individual income tax and corporate income tax, the chance of a wreck are that much greater. So how do you balance that system? Well, you need eventually some other source of revenue. Probably it'll take a crisis to get there, but that's the problem. Is we have an unbalanced system. It's a disconnected system. The state makes a lot of decisions in the property tax arena for the purpose of being competitive and driving economic development. Decrease the business equipment tax, eliminate the business equipment tax. We took the generation tax, the telecom taxes down 20 years ago cut them in half. So that increases economic development, which increases income tax revenue to the state. Doesn't do much for local governments because at the same time you cap, because the voters want a cap on property taxes. Generally, as you get more property value in a local government, that just reduces the mill levy. It doesn't increase the revenue stream that local governments have to provide services, unless they have new property. So it's balancing those two things out in the policy arena so that you don't have the legislature sitting here making decisions that hamstring local governments that are providing services to you and average citizens, and doing things with the income tax system you can flow that income tax money back into the local governments, and that's probably what the state needs to look at doing, is revenue sharing that stream of revenue so it doesn't all build infrastructure and programs in Helena, and more of that gets back to providing services to the local people.
Mm-hmm. Great, nice magic wand there. Appreciate that. Gene, how about your magic wand? What do you think is the appropriate role for state government in your arena? What's the appropriate role for state government?
Well, I'm glad you weren't asking me about the ideal healthcare system, because I was getting anxious about that and looking for a mental health care provider, and we seem to be lacking those in our state. So what is the role of state government? And, I think that when it comes to the boards and the regulatory boards, it's protecting patients. And the other part of state government is really finding the venues that can help healthcare institutions and healthcare providers be innovative. They're well educated, they're well trained, and they know what is medically needed. And government just needs to get out of the way and let these individuals and these organizations do what they do best, and that's take care of the patients. And state government needs to watch out for patients so that individuals who aren't competent or might take advantage of those payment provisions or pieces for their own good, that there's sideboards available for those individuals.
Great. Thank you, Gene. So, David, I recall back in the mid-late 2000s, during the depths of the Great Depression, contractors were starving to death. There was no work out there. They were laying off people, selling equipment. How do you level the feast and famine aspects of your industry that, buys so much in terms of goods and services and materials that stimulates the rest of the economy? How do you level that out?
We had a panel of contractors a while ago. Hello, there we go. Had a panel of contractors who went through that time period, and the consensus from all of them is probably the same thing all of your businesses: cash is king. And cash in the bank guards you for those rainy days. You can always turn the equipment back to the equipment dealer and let it be his problem. But in the long and short of it is, a lot of them, some of them went down to Mexico and worked for a while, went to other states, found different lines of work to do. So diversity in your portfolio. I think cash is king was the number one thing that came back. But also don't overextend yourself, and I think that's a real nervous idea right now for a lot of business people and contractors, to not overextend yourself right now and try and do the work you can with the people that you have. I think the one other thing I would add to all of this too is that the paradigm shift that needs to happen for my industry, and we need to start this too, is you don't have to go to higher education and 4 years of college. We need those people. We need engineers to design the bridges, but not every kid needs to go to college. I'm sorry that our university systems are sponsors of your program here, but half of the kids that graduate every year are going on to higher education, and 1 year later, a quarter of those are coming back to their community because they didn't make it, and it was an expensive lesson. So, I'd love to see them learn how to weld or do some carpentry work or anything in the trades, because we always say, when you're 25 years old, do you want to make 60 grand or owe 60 grand? So that's where we're at.
Excellent. Okay, it's time for some audience interaction. I know there's going to be a microphone or two floating around the room, and I did not bring my timepiece up here, so I really have lost track of how much time we have left for the panel. Okay, we got about 15 minutes for some questions. We got some of Montana's great business leaders up here, so hope you've formulated a couple questions. Who's up? Who's up? There we go. There's a question in the back corner.
Howdy, I'm Chris Laslovich with Blackfoot Communications, and while we benefit from being members of some state and national associations, I'm wondering if I'm from an industry that doesn't have one, or I'm not sure how to get involved, where would I start?
Any comments from anybody on the panel? I certainly, you're in the midst of, the general business organization of Montana, and that's the Montana Chamber. So, great place to start. Your local chambers, but you're probably accurate that, you're not a bank, so you don't have much reason to join the Montana Bankers Association, although I'd certainly welcome your involvement. And I did mention the Montana Taxpayers Association. They put out some great information. They have a couple of meetings throughout the year that are very, very informative. So I would pass that along. I have a question. It came up during the prior panel, and Taylor Brown did a great job of teeing this up to legislators, but it has to do with the question of relevance. And at least in my experience, recent legislatures seem to consider associations, businesses, less relevant as we stand up and testify in committees and as we approach them in the hallways with our concerns and expressing views of our members. Let me just toss that out. I'll let the association folks address it first. But am I accurate in that assessment? And what do we need to do to be more relevant?
That's a great question, Kerry. And I would say, the nature of associations is that it's competitors coming together to advocate for something that's a common interest area. And that's why the chamber is unique, because there are so many different industry perspectives here. But, you start looking at our associations, they're very narrow and they're very competitive, but they understand that the high tide raises all ships. Sorry to use a phrase like that, but it's true, And we just gotta always be there, never go away, never take a day off from the legislature or following what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Gene?
I'd add in that regard is just engagement and the importance engagement of associations, because that's where the expertise lies. So providing that resource to the legislators, whether or not you agree with the bill or not, but just be an available resource as well. I would say that I've seen a trend downward in recent years in regards to accessing associations for that very expertise. I'm going to go back to Title 37 and the reform bill that's coming up. And one of the things, and I think this shows where associations fit in the minds of decision makers, is as part of that Title 37. One is that the governor can right now remove individuals on boards for cause. This new legislation is that the governor can remove an individual with or without cause. So he can dismantle a board in one fell swoop. It also includes, as part of that legislation, that if you are on an association board or on a committee of a board that they deem to be related, you cannot serve on a regulatory board. So I don't know about you, but I have, a small number of physicians that are heavily active in policy for many, many years and have a historical relevant discussion they could have at those board levels, and they aren't able to serve because they're on my board. I have a 45-member board. None of those could serve on that regulatory piece. So again, I invite you to take a look at that Title 37, take a look at those kind of overarching provisions. It also, comments made is, where is the authority going with Title 37? It's going toward state government. It's going away from your regulatory fashion that we've lived in the past, which is you regulate your own.
Good points, Gene.
One quick follow-up point to that. The minority leader mentioned scorecards, and that maybe we should look differently at our scorecards. A lot of our associations do scorecards. Some of them kind of keep them close. Some of them share them a little bit. And the Montana Chamber and the Montana Contractors Association both got lit up pretty hard in the last session before last one about the way we scored some legislators. Oh well.
How about Brian or
One thing I'd say is, you're focusing on a local level here too. There's national associations too, and from our perspective, EEI is on our electric side and American Gas Association. Of the 50 largest electric and gas utilities in the United States, we're like in the 40s, like 42, 43, and one of the biggest by square miles, one of the smallest by market cap. And so we get a lot out of, on the national level, learning from the big players. What are they doing? What are they seeing? And we look at, so think about that aspect too.
Bob?
I guess I'm unique in this group, but I've been on both sides of this deal. I served 16 years in the legislature, so I got lobbied a lot, and then I became one. But it is, as Gene said, it's a communication thing. You got to talk to legislators in a way that they can understand what you're saying, and you got to show up. And so I mean, I go to tax committees every day, whether there's a bill or I'm interested in it or not, because the committee members, you hope, are sitting in the committee every day for the whole committee meeting trying to learn something, and if they know you're sitting there, I think that helps. You also got to be engaged in the interim. You know, the interim committees meet and work on a lot of things, and it's important if they're working on areas that you show up and participate there and let them know that you're interested and that you have ideas that they're a little more willing to listen to at that time also. But I think the mood of the legislature has changed, and partly due, I mean, we've been in a term-limited legislature for over 20 years now, but you just have a lot of new people all the time. I mean, 30, 40 new legislators every session, and most of them come with the idea that, you know, government's not really a great thing. I'm here to change that, and so they look at the associations and the lobbying corps as part of the problem as much as part of the solution. But in the end, if they're honest, they don't know a lot about any of the topics. They have an opinion on a lot of things, but they don't have a lot of background knowledge. And so associations got to provide that to them. And if what they use it for is, you know, you don't have a lot of control over, but if you don't show up and provide them the kind of information that they need to hopefully make a good decision, you know, you're not contributing much to the process. You don't win them all, but you might win one once in a while, and you just got to stay there and keep pitching.
David, do you want to take a crack at it?
Well, not being a leader within the association framework, but I do sit on the board of the National Trade, APCIA, which is American Property Casualty Insurers. And they have been very effective. There's been two issues that has gone down recently. California Department of Insurance has been sitting on rate filings for auto in a way that's wonky but has become highly problematic. And separately, Florida had two hurricanes in 1 year and a property insurance market that was fundamentally a mess. And I was really, really impressed with the way that APCIA ran a grassroots campaign. And it, from somebody looking at this glass from the outside in and not being part of the leadership, it really impressed upon me the importance of associations demonstrating that they are a synthesized voice of a list of constituents that is both deep and broad. And I think that these associations do that well, and I think it's I think that can be one of the best deterrents to not being dismissed as a single voice, that these associations represent a lot of good, hardworking people.
Great. David, thank you for teeing that up. And when you all get emails from your association, whether it be the chamber or your trade association, urging you to contact the legislator, that's what he's talking about, is that's where the real voice is and that's where the influence is. Bob, did you have another comment you wanted to make real quick?
You know, people always say, why should I join an association? You know, well, I liken it to a fire department. You know, everyone pays to have fire coverage, pays to have a fire department, and you hope you never have to use them. But when you do have a fire, that's not the time to organize a fire department. You know, and that's the same with associations and all of these things. You got to be ahead of the game. You got to have the infrastructure in place to participate in effect.
Great point. Do I see Taylor back there with a microphone? That's always dangerous, yes, Taylor with a microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And my question is for Brian Bird. But before I do that, the comment about associations. I'm Taylor Brown with Northern Broadcasting, but I also represent LO Cattle Company, which is a 63-year-old family cattle ranch in eastern Montana. And so when I'm standing my question to Brian, my question is about, you mentioned the word crisis 3 times, including the time you apologized for saying the word crisis. I don't think you should apologize for saying the word crisis, because out on the Brown Ranch, it was 31 degrees below zero last week. And I can't think of a worse crisis than if we wouldn't have had electricity to those stock wells or to those vehicles last week. I can't think of what bigger crisis there would have been. And by the way, speaking of associations, I'm also a member of the Montana Stock Growers Association, so proud to see Ray Lee and John here for the whole thing. You're president and executive of the Montana Stock Growers here, along with the manufacturers and the chamber. It's so good to see you associations working together and trying to get on the same page. But my question to Brian is, Brian, you did not mention, when you talked about that broad portfolio, you didn't talk about hydro. And I am concerned about hydro because it's a big part of your portfolio, but I keep hearing about this idea of getting rid of dams, not so much in Montana, but what's going to happen with hydro?
There's no damn way we're getting rid of our dams in Montana. One thing I just say on that, first of all, when we bought the hydros back from PPL, that was a fantastic stroke for this company. And believe it or not, it was a fantastic stroke for all of you. Even last night, someone told me, I think you paid too much for the hydro facilities. My comment back was, it was an auction. Whoever wins the auction paid more than the others. The good news for us is no one knew at the time that PPL would we be willing to sell just the hydros. They were trying to sell the hydros and the coal-fired assets at the same time. And we finally came back to them and said, we can't take the incremental coal at this point in time, but we'll pay you this for the hydros. And if anyone knew they were just selling the hydros, we wouldn't have gotten those plants. So I would tell you this, if we were to buy them today, we'd pay at least 1.5 times more, possibly 2 times more for those types of resources. And when I say there, you did hear me say it's the best resource. It's the best renewable resource because it's clean and it provides high level of capacity. Our dams are run-of-the-river dams, so it's consistent flow. Obviously, the seasonality can impact it, drought can impact it, so water is really important to us. But we get very high levels of capacity for that, like 60%. Versus wind and solar can be teens to 20s, right? And sometimes lower. So the thing about capacity, all resources have value, and we have to treat it that way. And my concern is, from a crisis standpoint, is the government seems to be doing a lot for one type of resource. And the issue is, and EPRI and every major consultant who understands this industry acknowledges the need for natural gas to be a bridge for the future. And until we find long duration resources like hydro, if we could build more of that, where when I mean long duration is, in Montana, we don't have 4-hour peaks. We don't have 4-hour peaks like you would in California. We have 4-day peaks. And batteries, you can't have enough batteries. And batteries are certainly going to be helped to offset some of the intermittencies of wind and solar. So they're great. But what I'm nervous about is what you were nervous about, 4 days of minus 30 degree temperatures. I need a resource I can turn on and run. You're not going to come after us if it's 60 degrees out and you had a power outage for 3 days. But you're going to be pretty ticked off if it's minus 30, and people's lives are at stake. And we see this happen in this country, and we're not doing anything about that. And that really bothers me. We're focused on various resources, and we need to be focused on the total delivery of energy to our customers. And that's what I'm worried about. And what we can do from a permitting and process standpoint to make us address this situation. This country's really good. If we see a crisis and we actually go after it and fix it, this country's better than any country in the world to do that. But we're not doing that with this issue right now in this country.
We got time for 1 minute. One question, 1 minute. Anybody got something burning? Anybody? There we go. Go ahead, stand up and just tell us your name and what your question is. Well, I'll take a quick stab at it since I'm the moderator and have been involved with the Chamber for a long time. Prior to and during legislative sessions, the Chamber hosts a weekly luncheon meeting. We call it the Business Caucus. And we do kind of a round robin. What's on your menu this week? What are you working on? How does it affect other interest groups, other stakeholders? And I think we do a pretty good job of cross-pollinating, networking, trying to work together. Not much happens constructively in the legislative arena if you're the Lone Ranger. I think everybody in the lobbying world will attest that you don't get very much done if you come to the legislature with a great idea and you don't share it with anybody and you rely solely on your own expertise and knowledge to explain to committees and legislators why it's important. So we're always up for new ideas. Charles is the guy holding the microphone. He's in charge. Charles in charge. And but if you do have ideas on how to network business groups, issues that affect your business, your industry, and other stakeholders, he's the one that can really kind of bridge those discussions. So with that, we are out of time, and I'd like to thank our panelists, David, Gene, David, Bob, and Brian. Thank you for doing such a great job, and thank you all for being here. Courtney, are we teeing it back up for you?